Good evening, everyone. I'm calling this June 6th Planning Commission meeting to order here in Sammamish City Hall. Tonight we're going to have a presentation and some public comment and a public hearing on the Shoreline Master Program. But before that, we have a few items to take care of. So first, let's do roll call starting on my right.
Rituja Indapure.
Mark Lewis.
Mark Boffman.
Eric Brooks.
Josh Amato.
Larry Crandall.
Commissioner Regina Farrell is absent tonight, and she let us know that ahead of time, so we will carry on without her. All right, first is approval of tonight's agenda. Does anyone have any comments or objections to tonight's agenda? Seeing no objections, the agenda is approved. Next, approval of the meeting minutes from the May 16th meeting. Everyone had a chance to look at those, and does anyone have any comments or corrections? I will mention one person commented to me that in the past there has been, and I don't think we need to change anything. In the past, however, with some public comment, there's sometimes a few words that say what the public comment was related to or something, just a couple of words about what it was about, and I do think that that's useful. I don't necessarily believe we need to go back and change these, but in the future, I think that would be a useful thing. Okay.
Just as a sidebar, and that the attending the parliamentary procedure things, they recommended against that. They said just put down who spoke and not what they said, because it's difficult to correctly or positively or negatively capture what is said. So, you know, maybe we can talk to staff about that. But
Okay.
And again, I like brief minutes.
A quick read. Great. Okay, any other comments on the minutes from May 16th meeting? All right, seeing no comments, those are approved as well. Next, we have public comment on non-agenda items, so something unrelated to the Shoreline Master Program review. Does anyone have any public comment on non-agenda items? Mary?
Hello, my name's Mary Wichter. I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish, Washington. I wanted to speak tonight on, I heard the comment in the last meeting. It said a lot that's too small to build. And I wanted to talk about that for a minute because there's different zoning throughout the city. And for example, an R4 zone means you can build 4 houses on 1 acre. And that's an acre's 43,560 square feet, so 1/4 of an acre is a little bit under 11,000 square feet. But the city does have quite a number of lots, particularly around lakes and in old historic plats, that the lots are much smaller. They're smaller than the zoning size, so they're like 10,000, which is a little bit smaller, or 7,500, or even 5,000, or 2,500 square feet, or 1,000 square feet. And then there's also small little irregular parcels that are not a regular shape and they're cut across by things. And then there's tiny fragments of parcels. And I'm hoping that somehow those would be deemed as unbuildable in the city, or that people couldn't build something on them. And the reason that I'm bringing it up is I live in the neighborhood of Tamarack, which is a historic plat before stormwater was regulated in 1977. And it's next to Inglewood, which was originally the town of Inglewood, which was platted in 1889. And recently I've gone through kind of lot by lot and found at least 9 lots that are marked as unbuildable. It says it on the King County Parcel Viewer when you look it up. But they've sold recently to somebody, and the person is trying to apply for building permits or reasonable use exceptions to be able to build properties. So the concern that I have is when people buy a lot, particularly if it's really cheap because it's restricted or has like a lot of environmentally critical areas on it, they do want to build on it anyway. They want to have the lake view, they want to cut down the trees, but it's on steep slopes or landslide hazard areas or erosion or other things. And I guess I'd like it looked into is if something's marked unbuildable, shouldn't it be unbuildable if you bought it that way? And there shouldn't be ways of getting out of that. And if there are, the 3 things I've learned between listening to the trail and reading a lot of code is you're supposed to avoid impacts, you're supposed to minimize impacts, And if you absolutely have to do them, you're supposed to mitigate them. And there should be some compensating things that are done, and there should be some monitoring. So I see that missing in city code and some of the planning. So I wanted to bring that up tonight. It's an off topic from the shoreline. I was the person who put in the thing about the minutes. The minutes that you actually just passed don't even have the topic. It just says people spoke on the agenda. It doesn't say what the agenda was, and the agenda for that meeting was urban forestry management class. So I think it should at least include that. I think Robert's rules would be okay on that. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Mary. Anyone else on a non-agenda item? Okay, thank you. Next on the agenda is our old business that we're visiting this evening, which is the Shoreline Master Program. I'll ask the staff, I guess, if we have a presentation to go through.
Good evening. My name is Tracy Tree, Senior Planner with Community Development. Today, I will be representing CD on this business item on the agenda today. Before I start my presentation, I would like to introduce Washington Department of Ecology Planner Maria Sandercock to this joint hearing. She'll be representing Department of Ecology. Before I start it, Mary, you want to start with a brief introduction of the topic on the agenda today, and the purpose of this S&P update, and the goal, the requirements from the ecology.
Hello, thanks for having me today.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your name so I make sure I get it right and don't mess it up?
It's Maria Sanderco.
Thank you.
And it's also written up there if you need to write it down. I wanted to start by providing a brief introduction to what the Shoreline Management Act is, and I cut this quote out of the Act that I think does a good job of summarizing the goal, which is to prevent the inherent harm in an uncoordinated and piecemeal development of the state's shorelines. And the SMA has 3 general policy areas. That is to protect the environment of the shoreline, to enhance public access to our state's shorelines, and to also foster water-dependent and preferred uses in our shorelines. And this is achieved through local shoreline master programs that the cities develop. And these are a cooperative program between both the city and the state. In the City of Sammamish Shoreline Master Program, the city went through a comprehensive update of the S&P, which was approved by the Department of Ecology in 2011. And then the city also went through a limited amendment, which was approved by Ecology in 2017. The Shoreline Management Act, after those comprehensive updates, requires cities to periodically review their S&P at least every 8 years. And the statute actually establishes deadlines for that. So all of the cities in Snohomish County, King County, and Pierce County, I think I have a little graphic, yeah, are the first cities that have to go through this. Their deadlines are June 30th, 2019. And the periodic review has what we're calling 3 buckets. So the first bucket is the city should review their S&P against any changes to the Shoreline Management Act or its guidelines. The city should review any changes to its comprehensive plan and development regulations that might be relevant to the S&P, like the critical area ordinance. And then also look at any changes to local circumstances, new information, improved data that might be relevant to the S&P. The Department of Ecology, to help with that first bucket, we've developed a checklist that sort of goes through what are those changes to the Shoreline Management Act that the city might want to look at and see if those need to be incorporated. So the city has completed a checklist to identify those items. For that third bucket, in the case of Sammamish, some changes to local circumstances included a potential increase in the intensity of recreational development on Lake Sammamish. So they conducted a study to look at that more and identified some amendments based off of that. And then what we're kind of doing tonight, we're in the middle of a 30-day joint state and city public comment period. So the comments go to both the city and the state. And then tonight is our joint city and state public hearing. We're holding these together. And then after the public hearing, the city is going to collect all the public comments and provide responses to those comments and identify any changes to the S&P amendments that might be necessary. Then the city is going to submit those comments and the proposed amendments to the Department of Ecology. We're going to provide an initial review of those amendments to provide an initial determination of consistency with the Shoreline Management Act and the guidelines. We'll send that determination back to the city so that they have that information to decide if they they need to make any more changes. And then the city will actually adopt the amendments to the Shoreline Management Act and then submit them back to the Department of Ecology for our final action on the amendments, hopefully for approval. And just a reminder, when we get that final submittal, we're required to review all S&P amendments to ensure consistency with the Shoreline Management Act and its implementing rules. So that's what we'll be doing at the end. And if anyone has any questions, I can answer those now or afterwards. I've got my information up here too.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions for Maria? Pretty quiet up here. I don't think we have any questions for you.
So I will start with a little bit background what happened in the May 2nd Planning Commission meeting. We held a study session during the May 2nd Planning Commission meeting. We have a brief introduction about Shoreline Management Act, Shoreline Master Program, what is Shoreline Master Program update process is, what is periodic review requirements are, and also we touch a little bit what's the public outreach and estimate timeline for this whole SMP review process. We also review a few public comments during the study session, also receive feedback from Planning Commission members. Once after the study session, the city issued a notice of public hearing, which offers a public comment period starting from May 7th to June 6th, so which is a 30 days minimum public comment period. So during this time, we should receiving a couple of written public comments from the public, which is including in the agenda bill today as exhibit number 1. And before I dive into the detailed changes on the SMP, I just want to reframe the periodic review requirements are. First of all, we want to make sure the compliance with the requirements of the SMA or state rules that has been added or modified since the last SMP update. We also want to make sure the SMP remains consistent with the mandated comprehensive plans and regulations. Lastly, we want to make sure all the amendments deemed necessary to reflect changes, circumstances, new information, or improved data. So as you remember, last time we proposed quite a changes in the SMP. So regarding those proposed code amendments, we want to also make sure they will not foster any piecemeal development of the state laws, shorelines of the states. So in the city of Sammamish, there's a Pine Lake, Beaver Lake, and Lake Sammamish. Those 3 lakes body will constitute shorelines of the state. The amendments also want to make sure it's consistent with all the applicable policies and standards of the SMA. We also make sure all the procedural requirements are being met for planning, public noticing, and cancellation. Then lastly, we want to make sure it satisfies master program guidelines, requirements, and standards, including the amendments will be now result in a net loss of shoreline ecological functions. So under the SMP, there's the SMA established the concept of preferred use within shoreline jurisdiction. So this shoreline use is including the order of preference. So you can see the first one is single-family residences, and then it's ports, shoreline recreational uses, water-dependent industrial and commercial developments, and other development providing public access opportunities. The reason I want to point it out because, as you can see, single-family residences is listed as #1 priority under the Shoreline Management Act. Compared to other jurisdictions in King County, such as Seattle, Redmond, Bayview, city of Sammamish shorelines has very simple uses compared to other jurisdictions. So in the city, majority of the uses is associated with single-family residences. And there are very few shoreline recreational use, which is we're going to talk a little bit more today. And also, I want to point it out, under the WAC 173-26-230, it says local governments are encouraged to prepare master program provision that distinguish between shoreline modifications and shoreline uses. So under the act, it's saying if you want to do any modifications to the shoreline, you have to be support of a shoreline preferred use. So for instance, if you want to build a house or build a dock on a shoreline property, so this type of structure needs to be necessary to support of a shoreline preferred use. So in this case, the dock is constructed in a purpose to necessary for supporting the preferred shoreline use, which is single-family residential use. So during the last study session, I mentioned there's a checklist which is required by ecology. We have to complete, make sure the current SMP is consistent with the state law and the policies. And also, besides the checklist, we also offer to identify some of the local issues. So the first local issue identified, which we will talk quite a bit last time, is regarding the recreational use lot. And the second local issue identified is regarding the fish-bearing stream definition. Regarding the local number 1 recreational lot use, we talked quite a bit during the last meeting, and I wanna differentiate. There's a different type of recreational use within shoreline jurisdiction in the city. So I put it in a 3 bucket. The first bucket is for one single family residence with a private residential dock on a shoreline property. So for instance, if you have a piece of property on the lake, and you build a house and have a private residential dock, so the dock will be considered as a modification necessary support for the preferred use in the shoreline jurisdiction, which is a single-family residential use. And the second bucket, I put it under, is for private homeowners association lakeside recreational use lot with a shared use dock. So more than often, because the King County Trail and the Sammamish Parkway is running through a lot of property, so it makes the property being separate from a small portion on the lakeside and another big portion on the other upland side. So in this case, the HOA build a dock on the lakeside, and then the dock will consider as a modification necessary for the construction of the home, which is located upside in the upland area, supporting the preferred shoreline use, which is also residential use. So this is the second bucket. The third bucket, which is the main topic, we want to dig a little bit bigger on this category, so which is for new expanded private beach park use. So currently, the shoreline master program does not have a defined this type of use. It's missing from the permitted use table. It doesn't require, it's completely silent in the SMP. So this is the issue we are trying to address. In order to address the issue, first of all, we want to add a new definition. What is a private beach park? So the private beach park will be, is a privately owned shoreline property used by an owner or an ownership or membership group for water-oriented recreational activities that are not associated with or subordinate to a residential use with associated facility necessary for access, activity use of shorelines, and allowance for private docks, floats, and mooring buoys. So the way we want to regulate this type of use is to require a conditional use permit with the following requirements. There's 3 key requirements. The first one is the city will require the applicant to provide an access plan, demonstrate how this site will be accessed and where the parking will be provided to adequately address the intensity level of the anticipated use on this piece of property. And the second requirement will be require the applicant to provide a site management plan to tell us what's the proposed amenities are adequate to accommodate the potential use on this piece of property. And the last requirement will require the applicant to provide a vegetation enhancement planting plan demonstrating the proposed use will not result in a net loss of shoreline ecological functions. And also, lastly, I want to mention there's a lot of existing use on the lake, which is already operating as a private beach park. So for this type of use, the city will determine this is a conforming. However, if one day they want to come in to expand the use, or they want to modify it or intensify the use, then a conditional use permit will be required. Thank you.
Okay, is that it for the presentation, or is there more?
That's it. Thank you,
Okay.
Chairman.
Great. All right, so we should have a bit of discussion if people have questions, which I'm guessing a few of you may have some questions. So I'll go ahead and ask for questions or comments.
Go ahead and start. I attended a Department of Resources seminar on tree protection during construction this morning, and there was a quote on the wall that probably applies to a lot of things. The failure to have a plan is a plan to fail. So it looks like our staff is on the right direction, putting a plan together.
Others? I'm trying to find it. Scrolling through your iPad. Ratuja?
Yep. So thank you, staff, for the presentation. I had an opportunity to reach out to staff earlier last week and get some of my questions answered. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on the site access plan and the site management plan, maybe give some examples on what you're looking for, because I know when we met in the previous meeting in early May, the staff had recommendations, a matrix, and there were very specific requirements as to how many spaces for parking, or what kind of garbage disposal or even restroom facilities need to be, but they're not there in the new suggested improvements. And I want to understand, if somebody came with an application, what kind of guidance would they have in knowing what they're supposed to do?
So speaking of that, I remember from the previous meeting, we had a quite discussion from the planning commission say all different properties have a different physical conditions. Some of them are a little bit bigger, some are a little smaller, some of them they don't have access, some of them they only have walking access, or some of them completely vegetated, some of it is not very vegetated. There's all different physical conditions. So that's one of the reasons that we instead of requiring hard requirements for specific parking, bathroom, storage unit, we want to give the applicant a little bit more flexibility to demonstrate how they can make this work. So speaking of parking, so if they have a parking space, and also depends on the number of the users. If they have only one user, then or they live nearby, they don't really need a parking space. So it all depends on the different scenario of the proposal. I hope this answers your question.
On that same topic, when you're talking about restroom facilities, what guidelines are these folks going to get regarding how to comply? Is it going to be a surprise when their permit is denied and they have to do a bunch of research, or is there going to be some guidelines up front where people that want to do improvements will have some sort of idea of what it involves?
David Pyle, Community Development. Good evening. Great question. So what we had previously proposed was a hard requirement that if you were going to have a certain number of owners, that you would then be required to make certain improvements. And that was something that we saw where other jurisdictions had required certain amenities for different levels of intensity of activity. The intent behind those amenities was to avoid instances where there may be individuals using the bathroom in the woods, so to speak, right? So we heard what the members of the community had to say, we heard what the commission had to say, and we took a look at the rules and we took a look at the different sites that we were seeing. As Tracy just mentioned, there are many different types of properties down there and different types of users down there. So what we would be looking for from an applicant is really a method of how they're going to manage it. And it's really, what we're trying to do is prompt them to think about it, first of all, that, you know, going down there and enjoying it is all great. We agree. It's a great thing. People have access to the lake. But when you're down there with the family and you have children and they have to go number two, so to speak, where are you going to do that? What's going to happen? You know, is it going to be a thing where they're suddenly using the lake? We have had complaints from people along the lake over the years where there are, you know, there's someone doing their business in the hedge next to my house. You know, and it's something that we have heard. So we have to see both sides to this. These recreational uses do have the potential to impact other property owners and other users along the lake. So what we're trying to do is strike a balance. There are multiple alternatives, you know, from the range of getting a special use permit from the county to get a porta potty with a pump truck, right? That's a higher level, down to a portable suitcase like marine toilet. I have a boat, I have kids, we have a portable marine toilet you can carry like a suitcase. Very easy to transport, get in the boat. So there's a range of opportunities of what you can do. And what we're looking for is for the applicant to tell us, given their intended level of intensity of use, how they're planning to manage it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a little confusion centered around preferred use. There was this preferred use single-family residence mentioned a number of times, but in our cover letter, it has a number of preferred uses, and single-family residence happens to be the first in the list, but recreational uses is in that list, so it strikes me as recreational use needing a conditional use permit. Can you help me kind of close that loop a little bit?
The city went through an extensive process as part of its 2011 SMP update where it engaged shoreline property owners along the lake and it identified appropriate regulations related to residential uses. We have not done that for our recreational uses, nor is it something that we have the capacity to do at this time. So absent our prescribing what might be specific regulations, restrictions, parameters around how recreational uses would develop on the lake. A conditional use permit is the next level of permit that is intended to adapt to individual site characteristics and proposed uses, and would therefore apply sort of customized regulation to something intended to abate any potential adverse impacts.
I have a question about, I like the direction you're going with this. One of the benefits of the matrix is that it's very cut and dry. You either are, you know, in compliance or you're not. This, it's very subjective. So you have one staff member here 1 year, another here the next, and then one person gets a permit and the other one doesn't. What kind of protects the public from the subjective nature of the way this could be applied?
It's a hearing examiner process, and ultimately the state is the decision maker. So it's important to note that all shoreline permits that the city processes are required to be routed to the state at different levels. A shoreline exemption is something the state usually just files and recognizes as being processed. With a shoreline substantial development permit, which is sort of the next level of permitting that you would do for if you were a single family homeowner and you wanted to construct a dock on your property along the lake, you would go through a shoreline substantial development permit process. And that is something that the city has to take to a hearing examiner who then determines, this hearing examiner serves in kind of in the role of an auditor and is auditing the city staff in whether or not it is properly applying the code to the project and properly applying the criteria. then that gets routed to the state and that gets filed. Now with a conditional use permit is specifically related to the use and establishing the use on the property. So what would happen is we would work with an applicant for them to put together narratives, plans that describe how they're going to be addressing some of the criteria. Then we would make a recommendation to the hearing examiner, much like a shoreline substantial development permit, and the hearing examiner would then be the decision maker, the arbiter on the issue. Then we would send the city's final decision to the state, and the state is actually the final decision maker for a conditional use permit. So it's protected at multiple levels, and usually the examiner is very aware of precedent because the examiner is a consistent individual or contract in the city. They do look at what the city has done in past instances or what other uses, whether de facto or not, may be in existence along the lakeshore.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, clarification question. Pine Lake and Beaver Lake would fall under this. This is not just about Lake Sammamish, correct?
That's correct.
So I had a couple questions on my list about who or what determines reasonable size and of the residents. For example, reasonable is the kind of operating term here, and who or what determines the reasonable access. And so what I'm hearing is that's the hearing examiner state that kind of those bodies are the ones that make those determinations.
Yeah, so that is correct. The staff work with the applicant initially to gauge whether something is reasonable and whether there are some other criteria that are part of state law for shoreline conditional use permits. So these are supplemental criteria that the city is intending to add. The other criteria are already in existence and they're already in our code for shoreline conditional use permits. The other thing going on here is that the way we see this is that if someone wants to establish or intensify a shoreline recreational use along the city's lake shores, I said recreational use, right, not residential, it really warrants a public process. And this is a public process that would require public notification, kind of like building a dock. If you want to build a dock on your private property, you have to go through a public process where there's a public notification, there's a sign that's put out, there's a mailing that goes out 1,000 feet around the property, there's a notice in the newspaper, there's an open public comment period. So this is similar to that. And what it does is it allows us to learn more about how this piece of property or the proposed piece of property might fit into the context of the broader uses along the shoreline. What elements we might want to be aware of with regard to how this proposed use would fit into that established fabric down there. And it would give neighbors opportunity to be aware of what's going on, review their proposed plans, and provide us feedback on that. So, that's similar. I think one of the comments we heard at the last meeting we had was, what if you owned a 4,000 square foot piece of land in the R4 district down the road here, and you wanted to turn that into a private park where you invited your friends over and you had a stage and you had concerts and you had barbecues and you were inviting, family members and friends over, and then you wanted to sell shares of that to friends. And you then now had a park that you'd established. You didn't have parking, you didn't have bathrooms, you didn't have a plan for trash collection. How would that be treated in the city? And how is this any different from that? So what we're doing is we're trying to provide a little bit of security for some of the neighbors down there. We have had many complaints over the years around these types of uses. When we see dock permits come in for some of these, we've had neighbors that have gone after each one of those permits and come in and complained about the fact that these types of uses shouldn't be allowed on the shoreline, that we should be preserving these lots that you can't put a house on, not allowing docks to go on them. So there is a little bit of balance that needs to be struck here, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
So along those lines, section or code 25.06.040, that talks about the city granting some relief. So can you walk us through some examples of what relief the city might grant to a particular owner of that land?
Just a sec here.
Sure, no problem.
Oh, so this is a little bit of a different issue. This is related to a change in state law, and what this refers to is, so say you're a shoreline property owner and you have a house and you decide that you want to restore your shoreline and remove the bulkhead and put in place some soft stabilization, beach gravels, logs, plantings, those sorts of things. And that what happens is over time, as a result of that, there is some advanced erosion that occurs, and the ordinary high water mark, because of that erosion, shifts closer to your home. So what this is saying is that if you are doing the right thing, removing your bulkhead, that the state allows you to memorialize the location of the ordinary high water mark at the point of when you're removing that bulkhead, to protect you against any potential advanced erosion that might occur, which one of the number one reasons why people didn't want to remove bulkheads and attempt to restore their shoreline, to restore natural processes, is out of fear that they would be penalized with loss of land. That as the ordinary high water mark moves, now the state treats the ordinary high water mark as a dynamic thing. That anytime you want to do development on your property, you're required to measure that development, the setbacks and those sorts of things from the ordinary high water mark at the time of the development. So what the state did here was they recognized that and they said, hey, let's change the administrative code on this, and let's give homeowners and property owners assurance that we're going to protect them if they do the right thing.
Thank you.
Could I ask a more overarching question? And if you'll indulge me just a little bit. So one of the things that I've struggled in really kind of understanding here is when does the need for a conditional use permit come into play? What's the practical reality on the ground of when this would happen? So for example, I'm trying to envision a variety of situations that could occur. If someone purchases one of these lots that already has a dock and they don't change anything, my presumption is that's an existing condition and they're not going to need to come in and get a conditional use permit, which most people wouldn't even think about the need to do that. But there's you can do a lot of what if scenarios. What if someone purchases a parcel that's technically big enough to build a house on, it hasn't been built on, and then they come in and want to put a dock in? Is that going to be treated as a private park use, or is it going to be treated as a residential use that's not yet developed? I mean, you can start to think through some scenarios, and I'm trying to figure out, what if someone has an existing property and they say, well, I'd like to reclassify this property as a park because now I can sell shares to 50 people, and I've got a small house here, but why don't I sell the shares to 50 people and provide access? That seems like it should be a conditional use, but it doesn't quite fit in the category that's being described here. I'm just trying to figure out, if you put in a fire pit, that's probably needs some review. What if you carry the fire pit down and set it on the beach? I mean, there's some question in my mind about when does this process come into play? How is this category applied? Is it clear enough in here that people will have the right understanding of when they need to come in and get this permit? And is it clear enough that the staff who are responsible with doing this can generally, for the most part, apply it properly? There's always unusual situations, but as you think through this, it feels like there's quite a few potential for unusual situations, or maybe I'm catastrophizing, and maybe the reality is it's just pretty common that people want to come in and get a dock, and that's when this comes into play. I'm not sure. Can you, now that you've indulged me to talk for a little bit, can you kind of comment on that?
I think you've hit upon the conundrum that we face, is that there are so many different scenarios that we encounter. And what we're trying to do is provide another tool in our toolbox to deal with that. The one that you referenced stood out to me. If you had a vacant lot that was large enough to build a home on and you just wanted to build a dock on it, you're not allowed to do that. And the reason for that is the state law is very clear with regard to uses and modifications that you can only modify a property to support a priority use. So unless you're building a house on the property and you're establishing a residential use, you can't build a dock. And that comes from state law. That's not the city's SMP. That is very clear in the state law.
So what defines, perhaps this is getting too deep into the topic, but what's the dividing line between a property that's buildable, so it falls exactly as you described it, or someone comes in and says, this is practically not buildable, so I want to get a conditional use permit as a recreational use and then put a dock in as a recreational use? I mean, is there a very clear dividing line between the two?
We don't need that line. We would not dictate that. If someone had a property that was vacant that they wanted to put a private park on, and they wanted to get a conditional use permit for it, and they wanted to build a dock that would support that recreational use once the use was established, or as part of the package of the whole thing, they could do that.
Interesting. Mark, did you?
David, I have a question about the tribal involvement again on this. So it says on the shoreline permit applications, all of them go to the tribe. Is that correct?
Yes, that's actually a requirement of Title 20. So we actually already have that requirement in place in our code.
So we don't need it here, or is that redundant, or what?
It would be redundant. We already send all applications to the tribe for their review.
Okay, and that's whether it has anything to do with fisheries or anything?
That's correct. It's a matter of any application that requires public notification under Title 20 is required to be routed to the tribes. It's one of the statements in there of who to route it to, and it says specifically that.
Thanks.
So along those lines, can you talk a little bit more about the change that is requested to define stream type F?
Yeah. So we have a definition for stream typing for a fish-bearing stream that identifies that in order to qualify as a fish-bearing stream, it has to be used by salmonids. That is different than the state definition, the Forest Practices Manual definition, which identifies that it has to be potentially used by fish or potentially have fish habitat. So what that proposal is to change the definition to match what the state definition is. There have been instances where it's been difficult to navigate between the different sets of rules and what the city's rule is versus what the state rule is, what the Growth Management Act says. This is an opportunity for us to update that. The next opportunity to update that, as Maria had put up on the screen, she showed you the sort of the hopscotch of Shoreline Management Act, Growth Management Act, and they kind of, unfortunately, they're not aligned. There was a House Bill 1653 some years ago that attempted to align them, but that was not successful. So because they're not in alignment, we have to play hopscotch. So we're going to be updating our critical areas rules next. So this is an opportunity to review this. If for some reason it doesn't get passed here, we will again take it up with the critical areas update.
So along those lines, I understand there isn't like a inventory or a directory of what the stream types are in Sammamish. We don't have a table which charts that. So if there is a stream that needs reclassification, how and when does that happen?
Yes, so streams are also dynamic. Once classified a certain way does not mean it will always be classified that way. There are things happening in the landscape processes. Streams get bigger, they get smaller, there's more water moved in one area or another. If we could lock it all down, that'd be great. It'd sure be a lot easier. So what we do is we apply a definition in each instance, and we require that a qualified professional, the applicant usually provides a report from a qualified professional applying the definition. to the property and identifying any streams or wetlands or things like that. So then we would route that to our third-party consultant, who would then again apply the definition and tell us whether they agree with the applicant's rating or typing or not. So what could happen in this instance is that the definition that we currently have would result in some streams being categorized as type F streams. The definition change could result in additional streams or stream reaches being categorized as type F that were not previously. So that is a potential outcome here. And what that would mean is that if you had a type NP stream on your property and suddenly the definition change occurred and you had a type F stream now, you'd have a larger buffer, which might change how you might go about designing a project or using your property.
And this would apply to any permit. It doesn't have to be shoreline permit. It could be anywhere in the city that the permitting could happen. And this, if that stream is impacting their development, it could change.
That's correct. And the Shoreline Master Program and the city's Title 21A50, the critical areas rules, are inherently intertwined. So this is why this is one opportunity to change that.
Great, thanks.
Can I just ask a little clarification of that? So I guess I'm not exactly sure I understand. There's salmon bearing, which means there's salmon there. There's potentially salmon bearing or salmonid bearing, which could be because there's a culvert that doesn't let them pass, but in the future could be changed. Then there's fish bearing, which is a much more general thing that says there's fish there. Then there's potentially fish bearing, which could almost be anything you can imagine. So what we're talking about conceivably changing to the type F definition. Which one of those categories is that? Is that the could have some fish in it at some point, sometime, maybe? Or is that very
Yes,
clearly defined?
or habitat that might support it, right? So that's the one where maybe there's a man-made obstruction, and there's a nice reach of stream that would support fish, and the fish could use it, but there aren't any in there now, but it meets the Forest Practices Manual definition, then that would be categorized as a type F for that reach.
So if this is intriguing. So if you have a stream that is blocked by a culvert that's 3 miles downstream from a project with the stream in question that's being, do they go that far off site to determine whether or not that is potential for fish habitat? Is that
Yes.
the process? Okay. Well, I think it's unfortunate to hear you say, but it's good to hear you say that the stream definitions aren't dynamic. I think Rituja had an email out kind of asking about a list of these things. And I think, on the surface, it seems like a great idea to kind of know more about our wetlands and the extents of our wetlands and the types of our wetlands and streams. And just like we do with our urban forest that we're doing and steep slopes and all these things seem to be an invaluable planning tool. So we understand what the potential build out for our city is and where the best place to build is. And just wondering if there's some medium ground, do we even know, for example, where the best, visual outlooks are, private or public visual access is from our, lake road or anything? We don't know so many pieces of information. I think that's what this is kind of highlighted for me, is our kind of lack of real robust understanding of what we're trying to navigate through. Just an observation.
I was going to follow up with, I don't know if you call it hydrology or not, but you use the term reach, and I was always under the impression a reach is a free-flowing portion of that body of water. Is that correct?
A reach would be a segment of a stream. So a reach of stream might be between two definitive points in the stream, much like a shoreline, a reach of shoreline. So it's a term that we use in the planning world to break something down into smaller, more palatable pieces. So you could talk about, reach 5 in a stream analysis, and you could break a stream down into different segments for the purpose of describing it. So what Sarah is bringing up is a copy of the proposed definition change, so you can actually see what we're talking about. We apologize for not including this in the packet. It's an additional local issue that we've been working on. There is also a representative of the Snoqualmie tribe in the audience who will likely be providing public comment during the public hearing component, and was also one of the individuals that provided written feedback on this issue to us, and has provided feedback on this to us in other occasions as well.
So I guess my concern on taking this issue up is that there's so much information that we don't have yet on the impacts of making the change or the impacts of not making the change, because we don't, I don't know what it does to private property owners or what it means for changing the classification for fish. Is there any, we can only take this up during this process or another time much further in the future? Is that correct?
Yes. So this is a window of opportunity because we are in there making changes. That this is something that. So with regard to our assessment of how the extent to which this impacts different streams, I'm not aware of any city in the Puget Sound that actually has a comprehensive stream inventory. Partially because you can't get on private property to assess these streams. So absent us sending staff out or consultants out to walk every stretch of stream in the entire city and apply the definitions, we will really not know what the extent of that is. So that's sort of one of those public policy questions of how do you, when you encounter these types of features in the city, regardless of the impact that it has on usability of land and various things, how do you want to protect them? If the answer is that you're satisfied with protecting them when they provide habitat for salmonids but not other fish, then that's the answer. But if the answer is that you feel that it's warranted to provide an additional layer of protection as a fish-bearing stream to all reaches of stream that provide habitat to fish, all fish, well, then that's a different answer. So it's really a public policy question. I realize that you're probably wanting data on how does this affect everything. The answer to that is that data will never be available.
Okay, so it sounds like we'd be making a public policy decision that could impact an unknown amount of people, or we are making a blind policy decision without any information. And
And that's one of the with natural resources, public policy decisions are inherently difficult because you don't always know the outcome. What I've heard, how I've heard it framed in the past is that if you want to take the precautionary principle into account and err on the side of caution, well, then that's the way you would rule. But if you're really wanting to know how it affects every little detail, then we might table it and move on because we're not going to be able to provide a report much like what you're asking us to provide.
is there a city that has made a change like this and then they were able to show that these results happened at all? Like they have any sort of results from a policy change like this?
So, that is one thing we could do is we could go back and take a look and see what other cities have actually adopted this. The individual from the Snoqualmie tribe may know that because he actually works with many jurisdictions and may be able to speak to that because they provide an extra layer of review and comment on all of the permit applications that we process. So, what they're looking for is for all of the cities to get into some level of consistency across the board as to how they treat streams within their fishing treaty areas, as I understand it. So that might be something that he could speak to when he has a moment.
Sorry.
Can I just ask, can you comment on, perhaps not, but it seems to me that likely the effect of this change would be that some existing streams have a greater protection zone, a physical buffer, if the classification changes. Is that really the primary? I mean, I'm sure there are other things about erosion on the property and other uses, but it seems like the most people would be affected by the size of the buffer that could impact their ability to use the property, or is that a misperception?
That's true. I agree with that. But the implication there is primarily around subdivision of land, because the city's density calculation is a net density calculation. So you would subtract out all of those critical areas and their buffers from the gross lot area, and what net area you have left, you would run your density calculation. So that would be definitely an implication here. My sense is that there would be reaches of stream that were known to be NP in the past, through past reports, that would then come back as type F. And we have had those debates with various tribal members and with various environmental stewardship-minded individuals in the city that argued that we were not applying our type F stream definition properly, because we should be protecting fish, right? But if you take a closer look at the definition, it exclusively calls out salmonids, and that has been the issue. So what we're doing is we're trying to get a sense, as a matter of public policy, where do our policymakers want to go with this? Is this something where they want to clean it up and they want to make a fish-bearing stream a type F protective of all fish, or do they want to retain the type F definition as being protective of salmonids?
I guess just as a follow-up, I'm asking maybe an impossible to answer question, but in my mind, I'm picturing currently a stream has a 10-foot buffer, and under type F, it's 50 feet. Are those numbers that simple, or are they more complex than that?
They're a little more complex. So in terms of it being binary, you're right. But with Tracy pointing out to me that a type NP currently in our critical areas rules is a 75-foot buffer, measured from, I believe it's the top of bank or ordinary high water mark of the stream, ordinary high water mark. And a type F stream has a 150-foot buffer.
So it's twice.
Yep.
And David, I just want to go back. So changing this definition brings us to what the state code says us or tells us to do, right? So it's not something that we are inventing just for our purposes. We are sort of coming up to the WAC 222-16030. So we're conforming to that as we make this change from salmonids to fish-bearing and fish. Is that correct?
And 3.1. So what happens there is there's two different parts to that. The state put together some guidelines for how to map streams using remote sensing on a broader scale for forest practices purposes. And what they said was that until those maps are made available, so there are some map resources that we do go to. There's Salmonscape, and there's FPARS. I'm trying to think of some others. There's a few of them out there that we go to in terms of our doing a desktop review, but then we always go out to the field and take a look at the actual condition and characteristic. What the state was told to do is to better develop these maps so that it's easier to find where there are fish-bearing streams. So WAC 222-16030 sets up parameters around how to go about developing those maps, what criteria they want to see for type F, type NP, type NS, and then 222-16031 is an older interim system that actually is based on field identification, because the way they used to have to do it in forest practices is actually go out, look at the field characteristics, and then make a call on whether it's a type F, type NP, type NS, like what we do. So what we are trying to do here is align ourselves with that. A program we would love to have here, funding dependent, because it requires a lot of funding, is to put together a much better mapping tool for all of our citizens, our customers, and staff. But absent that funding, we don't have it.
Right. I just want to, I think, make a quick comment on that. I think knowing, where Sammamish is from a buildable perspective, and also being a very environmentally conscious community, wanting to save our neighborhood character, I think I am definitely in favor of changing the definition, in ensuring that we can keep our natural habitat and protect it as much as we can, especially our kokanee fish, and making sure that we are not creating more obstacles, or at least removing some obstacles for our local fish. So yeah, I think this would be something that from a policy perspective, I think is protecting the environment.
Was there any discussion of, so part of our SMP is the shoreline comp plan chapter, right? So that's kind of part of the, is that right? And was there any discussion about changing any of the verbiage in the comp plan chapter as a result of this update? Because there are, the comp plan prioritizes and lists uses in order that it's not the same as the state code. So when most of our citizens read the comp plan, which is the most accessible document to most of our citizens, it gives a totally different impression about what they should be seeing come to fruition in the field, and it's not happening that way. And I'm just wondering if it makes good sense to consider getting those things kind of lined up. It may not tell people what they want to hear, but at least they'll know what to expect maybe a little more clearly.
If you had proposed changes, so one of the things we did do with the first meeting was include the comp plan chapter. I believe we've included it again with this bundle. If you had changes that you wanted to make to that, and you had, went to vote on it, and you had support of your fellow commissioners, that's something that we could forward on to the city council.
One other question, a lot of no net loss of ecological function is kind of scattered all over through these things. And I'm wondering, how are we doing on that? We had some public comment last time that leads me to believe that we're not doing so well on that. So we're supposed to be ensuring that. And what are we doing to ensure that in the city?
So we have a comprehensive set of rules regarding how you're allowed to utilize your waterfront property. And it also integrates into that set of rules by reference the city's critical areas rules. So if there are streams or wetlands that are located in the shoreline, they're regulated as critical areas using the city's critical areas rules. So one of the ways, so what happened with the adoption of the Shoreline Master Program in 2011 was the city provided what's called a cumulative impacts assessment to the state. And what we did was we prior to my time, my predecessors, what they did was they looked at the permitting data, permitting trends, and they sort of forecasted out the rate of development for the different types of uses that were included in the proposed Shoreline Master Program. And they looked at what would happen if those developments occurred following the rules that were prescriptively included in the proposed Shoreline Master Program. And they had to make a finding as to whether or not it led to a net loss of ecological function. So remember that net loss means that if you were to take a baseline of ecological function today, sort of an inventory, which we did as part of our 2011 comp plan, we did an inventory and assessment of shorelines by REACH, actually. So what happens is then that is used as the baseline. And what then happens is there's a biologist and a planner who work together. We had a consultant team, Environmental Science Associates, and they put together a cumulative impacts assessment based on the anticipated rate of development and redevelopment, applying the rules that were proposed to see what would happen if there were vegetation enhancement areas applied, if there were removal of bulkheads, if there was beach augmentation, if there was limitations on tree removal that were not in the rule prior, and whether or not that would result in a net loss of ecological function, or whether the rule as applied to the anticipated rate of development would result in a sort of a baseline that was maintained over time.
But no one's, okay, so it's kind of some kind of a metric that was set a while back for future things, but we don't know if it's working out that way, or we shouldn't expect to know if it's working out that way. Is that?
We do look back at permit data. So there's two things going on. There's one is what did development propose to include with it when it occurred? What was the existing condition when someone proposed new development or redevelopment? What was included with the proposal in terms of design features to avoid, minimize, design features to mitigate where impacts were identified, and then what was done over time to maintain that. One of the difficult things that we have is once a project is built and occupied over a period of time, we have a maintenance and monitoring requirement, and we do receive monitoring reports from applicants that recently completed projects. But once that codified requirement for maintenance and monitoring expires, then we're just simply left with code enforcement should someone call and complain. So, you know, people do change things. It happens. Whether or not they know they're doing it, you know, that's another thing, is education. But we can't force stewardship on people. It's something that just tends to backfire. So we try to work with people to invoke a sense of stewardship in them by working with them, more so as compared to carrying a heavy stick with regard to directing people how they can or cannot use their property.
Go ahead. So I know this probably won't apply too much to Lake Sammamish or, you know, Beaver Lake or Pine Lake, but can you talk a little bit about the forest practice permit and especially how it would work with reforestation? If somebody wanted to do reforestation, how would that work?
So I actually can't think of a property that's in our shoreline jurisdiction that would require a forest practices permit, but it is a state requirement. So if you were to rip down a house, consolidate some property that was big enough to actually trip up a forest practices permit and reforest it, and in 30 years you wanted to harvest the lumber, it would require a forest practices permit.
Okay, any other questions?
I just, so I know in our, in my initial feedback, I had a request to change beach club to private beach park facility. So is that something that we're doing, or is that something?
It's something we have done.
Okay.
There's another copy of the code up here. We
sorry.
actually made 2 changes that you had asked us to make,
Right.
and they're included in that. Now, we're going to apologize in advance because we highlighted the changes in green, and the text is in red, so it kind of looks like Christmas. You know, and it's a little hard to read because the green is really dark, and it wasn't intended. When you look at it on the computer, it looks a little different than it does when it prints out.
Christmas colors. All right, thanks, David.
I also wanted to suggest that we might offer our counterpart from Ecology opportunity to maybe correct anything that we said wrong, or if she has anything to add.
I didn't catch anything too egregious, so I felt the need to jump in and correct. I'm not sure if I have too much to add at this point. I think you did a really good job of answering a lot of those questions. So.
Anything that was just a little egregious, but not too egregious?
No, I don't have anything to correct or, yeah.
Okay, so from a process standpoint, I want to be clear because I'm not sure that we've made this really clear, and you correct me, I believe this is what we're doing. We're going to have a public hearing, and we're going to close the public hearing. Then we need to make a motion to recommend this to the city council and have debate and any amendments that we want to make and decide what we're going to recommend to the city council. And the purpose for all of that is to meet our deadline for the end of this month to get to the council and get these changes to the state. Am I stating that generally correctly?
That's correct. And much like your agenda, the council agenda, there's quite a bit of congestion there. A lot of things going on here in the city. So we're trying to keep things on schedule for multiple reasons, because one is to meet the state requirement, and number 2 is to make sure we get this on schedule to the city council, because moving things around on their calendar is equally as challenging as moving things around on yours.
I think it's important to recognize that, giving that context, we probably need to move something to the city council, even if so shouldn't hesitate to debate that, but we should in the end find a way to move something to the council so that we can comply with the schedule requirements. Okay. Let's move on to our public hearing. This is considered a joint public hearing for the city and the state. And I'm going to open the public hearing. I have a list here. Anyone who's not on the list that would like to comment can do so. These are 7 minutes per person. Sarah, am I correct with that? So you have 7 minutes per person. And I will do my best to read the names on the list, and we'll go down the best that I can read handwriting. Okay, so I'm going to open the public hearing. The first person on the list is Matt.
Hello. I'm Matt Bearwald, Snoqualmie Tribe Water Quality Manager. Thanks for your time. So, yeah, I made the suggestion to change the stream typing definition for type F streams to be consistent with the state. As part of, I think Maria showed the 3-county area, there's a lot of SMP updates. They're all going, they're all in the same cycle right now. And so having to sort of focus our attention on specific things, our program decided that, it doesn't get much more basic than where fish live, and protecting fish habitat is really important to the tribe and I think to the broader community. And so we, as part of our sort of review, we looked at how are the various jurisdictions defining fish habitat, and is it consistent with the state code? And Sammamish was one of a few that are still have this sort of salmonid preference, or a type F stream is only a salmonid, a stream that contains salmonids. And it's the tribe's view that there's this whole broader biodiversity of types of fish besides salmonid fish. And when you look at it as an ecosystem, they're all closely linked within the way food webs work. It's not just fish, it's not just aquatic organisms. It goes up and down the chain. I don't know, can I bring something up to show you guys? I printed this out. This is from Laughing Jacobs, actually. A tribal staff member took this photo in late April, and it's a huge mass of peamouth chub, which is a native fish. They're a migratory fish. They use the lake and the streams similarly to how kokanee do. They spawn in the streams and spend their adult times in the lake, but their spawn timing and all that stuff is different than the salmon, right? So that's part of habitat partitioning and niches. You can imagine if you're a raccoon or an osprey or a heron, and they have this huge influx of fish in your stream, and it doesn't have to be the size of Laughing Jacobs Creek. It can be a much smaller stream that these fish can use. You can imagine how that is an ecosystem driver. And it's not just the charismatic megafauna, as we like to call it. It's the stream bugs. Those fish are churning up the bottom, and the whole food web benefits from that, and it's all affected. And so, the change in from salmonid fish to any type of fish really helps to tie that all together. And it also preserves the opportunity for restoration in the future in terms of protecting the potential fish habitat that may be blocked by some man-made barrier downstream that may exist right now, but we could easily fix in the future. And so, that comes into play, especially with the fish that we want to recover, like kokanee, which, thanks to the city for being such a great partner on kokanee recovery. If we get more fish, if we start to actually get more fish, whether it's kokanee, coho, or whatever, they need that. They're going to need more habitat, and there's a carrying capacity to the habitat that we have, that they have access to. And if we want more fish, they need more habitat. That habitat has to be accessible, and it has to be in good shape, or it's not going to be able to support them adequately. And so that's the goal. That's the goal here. Is we're trying to preserve those habitats that could be restored, and to make sure that we're protecting the entire aquatic ecosystem, and not just salmonid fish. That's basically what I have. Since I have a little bit more time, I just do want to say, related to something else that came up, that I wish all jurisdictions did as good a job of tribal notification as City of Sammamish staff. They do a great job, and they're responsive to requests for follow-up information, and I wish everyone did as well as they do. They do a good job, so thanks, guys.
One thing that did come up is whether you're aware of any other communities or cities that have done something similar to what we're discussing, and is there any history with that?
So, having just kind of embarked on this with everyone's doing their updates now, I haven't seen it play out, but North Bend was early on, and they actually started in 2018 they did a combined CAO and SMP update, critical areas ordinance and shoreline master program update, and they had the Salmonid deal, and they changed it. They had their planning commission similarly had concerns. What is this gonna, how will this affect folks that have what's currently classified as a type non-fish perennial stream that ends up having, sculpin in it, or, some other non-salmonid fish. They ultimately saw fit to change that definition to be more protective, and I think it was framed well by David Pyle that it kind of comes down to the values. Is it something that City of Sammamish wants to protect any fish habitat, including recognizing how that affects the more charismatic fish that we like to catch and eat, like kokanee or coho or chinook. Or are we okay with just protecting salmonid fish and their habitat as it exists currently, which can change, as has been pointed out. But City of Mercer Island also had a salmonid fish preference. They went forward with changing it. Monroe staff are supportive. I don't think it's gone to an elected board yet. But you're not alone in facing this.
Great. Thanks for your comments, Matt, and thanks for
thank
joining
you.
us. Really appreciate it. Next, I believe, is Bill Way.
My name is Bill Way. I live at 3451 East Lake Sammamish Shore Lane Northeast in Sammamish. I've lived on Lake Sammamish and also own shares of the Weber Point Community Beach. I'm quite familiar with the lake shore property issues, having lived on Lake Sammamish since 1956. I generally support the planning department's draft community beach regulations. Actually, I do support them. I'm not quite sure of what evolutions have occurred since the last, as far as understanding fully, as far as developing a management plan that the applicant should present this or do that, and how that's framed. But it's a good faith response to a state of Washington Shoreline Hearing Board appeal that I filed on December 14th of 2016 in Way versus the City of Sammamish and Burnside Construction. That was defined as SSDP 15-00274 and SSDP 15-00275 Bernstead Shared Use Docks. That appeal was over a set of two 6-slip piers as a part of Sammamish Estates, bordered on both sides by the City of Sammamish Landing Park. And while I settled prior to going to hearing, it is evident that the staff took what I had to say to heart. So that's one of the, so that's sort of a nuance that I think is a backdrop that's pretty critical to you guys going forward, because the potential appeals and the success of those appeals have sort of already been developed and I don't want to get involved with all that. I don't want to spend the money, but it's important that you follow up per their recommendations. One of the things that was done is that I asked, as part of the mitigation, to have the mitigation be done on county park property. And Burns said, agreed. So the prior owners of these two little lots had, in typical fashion, cleared all the land, on the upland land that was owned by the county park as part of the park right-of-way. So this is kind of typical to community beach properties. In their case, they owned sort of like something between 0 to 10 feet of property between the county park property and the ordinary watermark. And again, this is typical on a typical 100-foot right-of-way owned by King County Parks. The community beach properties, somewhere around 35 feet or so is land that's owned by county parks. And maybe the last 5 to 20 plus feet is owned by the applicant. So the county built their trail, they built a ballast, they put staircases going down to the properties. The staircases are on public property. The sign says private property keep out, when in fact the property is largely owned by the public. So where I'm going with all this is that these properties are even more marginalized than the private homes that are lakeside of the trail because they are identified as unbuildable. So even some of the 0-foot setback homes that were approved through the county, through the city, where the home is right at 0 foot at the edge of the right-of-way, and their cars and their boats and their landscaping is in the right-of-way. So here we're further compromised, where the only thing left is 0 to, in some cases, less than 0. The property's been identified on the assessor's map as Joe's property, but there's no upland involved. It's entirely owned by the county park within the county park right-of-way. And in cases where you have 200-foot right-of-ways, which applies for at least a mile of shoreline, the land goes out into the lake, and the private dock goes beyond that. So anyway, to try to wrap up here, a couple things. The beach lots on Lake Sammamish are by definition marginalized properties, as they would have become, or they would have become developed. As marginalized properties, they should not be allowed to be developed with larger piers than single-family residential. They also should not be allowed to be developed with any piers without adequate accommodation for parking, bathrooms, and impact mitigation, such as the county right-of-way that has been typically stripped by the beach property owners. That's pretty much it. Thank you. I did earlier give most all of you a little write-up. I didn't give it to Eric and Ratuja. Can I do that? Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And while you're doing that, I will say that Mr. Mark Cross is next on the list.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have submitted written comments, and you all have gotten copies of it. I do want to follow the Snoqualmie tribe in endorsing what the city staff have endeavored to put together for you. I think the conditional use process is appropriate. Parking is important for any activity where you're, particularly where you're intensifying the use that you would otherwise get. Restroom accommodations. As I mentioned last week, the Lake Sammamish is on a 303D list, the federal list of polluted property, polluted water bodies, and it's a 5 out of 5, meaning it's in the worst category. The things that you don't have or that I'm concerned about are the same things that we heard from some of the planning commissioners tonight. One is, how small are these lots? Bill's talking about lots that even us old out-of-shape people can shot put across. We're talking about lots that are smaller than the desk that you sit at. Some of them are maybe only under 100 square feet. You haven't been told, you're just told they're remnant lots. Well, how big are they? How small are they? Why would you want to incentivize people to take some of the smallest remaining lots in the city, divide them into multiple ownerships, and then get docks that are bigger than the bigger lot next door? You end up putting the biggest docks in the lake on the very smallest lots, some of them as small as the desk you're sitting at. And when people go, whose bright idea was that? You'd have to say, well, I recommended it to the city council for adoption. I think you need some information on how big these lots really are that are being talked about. And as I understand it, they could apply to any lot along the lake. So somebody with an existing house could say, I've got bathrooms, I've got a garage, and I got 2 cars of parking. I'm going to separate it out into 3 ownerships amongst my adult children, and I can get a bigger goddamn lot. Or the dock can get bigger than the single-family house that I have now. How is that not a negative loss of value and function to the state? The other thing you don't have is a review of the recent permits that have been approved by the city to see whether they really are getting performance. They said that they had done an earlier kind of theoretical performance by a consulting firm, but they have not gone out and looked at like the last 10 or the last 20 permits and said, how are they doing? What did we approve, and how are the actual conditions of approval being met? You don't know that they're doing that. I mean, Ronald Reagan had that quote. It was from a Russian proverb, you know, trust but verify. And you're not trusting, you can trust what staff is saying, but you can't verify it. They're not verifying it for you either. You need to find out whether we're actually getting no net loss of value and function, and whether that's actually going to happen on these lots. And you don't know even how big these are. Some of them are extremely tiny, particularly after you do a survey to determine the actual ordinary high water. Again, a lot of them back up to county park property, and so the real activity ends up being a burden on King County property for what you're proposing to be intensive recreational uses that'll be fenced off for private use. Parking, really, just what's reasonable? You've got a whole parking section of your zoning code. And which category of use does it say whatever's reasonable? It'll say 1 parking space for 200 square feet, 2 parking spaces for a single family residence, maybe 1 parking space for an apartment or a condo, but it doesn't say whatever's reasonable. I think that you need to recommend to the council a code that actually would say the level of activity and how much parking can be expected, and within what distance, 1,000 feet, 2,000 feet? I'd ask that you keep the record open for 2 weeks so that you could understand the Burnstead permits that Bill referred to. There was part of the mitigation that was required for those projects that's not been implemented. The project's built, the project's occupied, There's boats in the 6 slips that were created, but the mitigation isn't completed. That brings me to one of the comments I have in here, which is the staff doesn't have access to a boat, as I understand it, so they can't actually go out from the water side and actually look and see how the waterfront mitigation or restrictions are actually being honored by the applicants. And if they're not being honored so far, you have no expectation you're going to get anything better in the future. You know, back in the day, I was a planner for this for Kitsap County, and we wanted to use the sheriff's boat to go out and look at waterfront properties to just do a cataloging of what was there. And they didn't want to loan us the boat because they were afraid we were going to run the lights and the siren. And we got it done, but we had to really promise we weren't going to run the lights or the siren on the sheriff's boat. But you don't have, aren't telling you, oh, we have access to a boat. Oh, we can go out and check these from the waterfront side to see if the mitigation's happening. If it's not, you're just relying on a theoretical analysis done by some years ago by a consulting team that said if this and this and this happens, then it's going to be okay. And you haven't verified any of that. Neither has staff. I guess the final thing I would say is that we all want to see people be able to access the lakefront. We all want to see people be able to have a boat or to have a dock. But you haven't found the locations with these remnant lots that really are worthy, in most cases, of having a dock and an actual area for an activity on the shore side that is going to allow room for part of it to be set aside as a natural area. And so you haven't really been able, you're not really able to make a recommendation to the city council that there are situations in which you can reasonably expect to have no net loss of value and function, and that your actual code and categories recommend the largest lots on the waterfront from the city side, from the Sammamish side, on the very smallest lots in the city. And I think that that's unreasonable. I do again ask that you keep the record open for 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Mark. I struggle to see that you didn't run the sirens and the lights, but maybe that was the case. Next is Mary Wichter.
Hi, my name is Mary Wichter. I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. I did submit 2 different emails with just information and ideas. One of the first one was the vacant lands map, which was from 2016. It shows the blue parcels, and online you can zoom in and check out. You can go around Pine Lake and Beaver Lake, and you can look on the shore, and you can figure out what percentage of parcels there might be. At the last meeting, the consultant had been talking about 35 to 40 parcels that they were concerned about. I think if knowing the number of those, the size of those, and where they're located is important. I think staff probably has that information and could either provide it in a list or as a visual map. I've just given you the vacant lands maps. Everything that's blue, you can see what it is. And I guess my comment on that is, just glancing at the map, it looks like we're about 15%, 10% maybe vacant. And I think the way a city develops in the last part of its growth needs to be different than, you know, when everything was vacant in the beginning or 50 or 60% developed. I think when you're 80, 90% developed, I think you have to do different restrictions. So that's kind of my feedback from that. And then somebody had sent me an article from the Seattle Times dated May 18th. I understand from Bill May that it's a little bit older, but it basically shows a bulkhead with a house that had a bulkhead and then what it looks like native planting. I think it's just a really good win-win situation for people in the environment. That was done under a grant. I believe it's called the Green Shores Grant, and on that website in there, Green Shores for Homes, there's actually 2 contacts for Seattle, one's at UW and one's at the city. So I think instead of using the big stick, incenting people to do things, I think is a really good idea. In reading, so I heard what the tribe had offered, and we are spending a lot of money in this city doing George Davis Creek, Zaccoose Creek, Ebright Creek, where 60 of the 112 fish came back, and I understand from Trout Unlimited they released 1,500 fry recently. Pine Lake Creek isn't talked about, but I believe King County's doing their thing on that, so those are salmonid. streams. So the fish culverts have to be done. I believe there's the lawsuit from that, and the city's been very productive in working with the county and getting things done and getting a lot of grant money for it. I guess the one concern I would have for the city is if you say, hey, fish anywhere, it's pretty hard to tell stormwater streams from regular streams, and stormwater kind of carries a bunch of things like metals and things that are bad maybe for the fish or maybe for the insects that they need to eat. And if you did anything that could potentially be, I don't know if you've ever looked at the map, but there's tons of tiny little streams in Sammamish. So you wouldn't want to get stuck having to do those culverts all the time, all the places. So I do think you need to do that. It is kind of, if people are kind of near one of those, you're going to take some of their property or put it in a buffer area. So I think you do need to weigh that and look at that. My suggestion for that is, I think what Mr. Pyle had said about mapping in streams is you're never going to have all the right data, and it's pretty complicated. But I will tell you this. The East Lake Sammamish Basin Plan and Northern Point Action Plan from 1994 has those mapped out in black and white, and they numbered them and they typed the different streams. And then King County IMAP, you can go on today and you can see, you can turn on a streams layer and it shows it to you. And I will tell you that I know that that's not all correct, because I know the Zaccoose one is at the wrong place. But the city of Sammamish, if you go into the Sammamish property tool and you turn on the layers, there's a wetland layer, but there's not, I think there's a wetland layer, but there's not a streams layer. And we've spent, like the Inglewood Subbasin was about a $400,000 plan. They actually walked George Davis Creek and got all that data. They did that for Ebright Creek, and they did that for Zaccoose and the current basin plan. So the city has some of that data, and my suggestion would be that the maps for the city should take what was given from King County from the old black and white days, or that is online from the GIS that they have, and map it with what we have from the basin plans, and I really think that should be done. And as a minimum, those streams should be done as fish streams. I also know from the kokanee cam, when they were watching for kokanee earlier, they had like a little camera that was in the stream, and I would look on, and there was a little fish there swimming all the time. So I wrote in, I'm like, what is that fish? And they said, it's a cutthroat trout. So there were fish that lived, even though there's the fish barrier, there are fish that just live up in the streams in that area. So just because you have the culvert doesn't mean that you're not having fish burying as part of it. And I don't know a lot more about that because I'm not a fisherman and not a big fish person, but I do think the environment should be protected. So for the May 2nd meeting, I'd actually read all 420 pages. I didn't read all 140 pages this time, but I did note a couple things. So the shoreline defines the upland area extending 200 feet landward of the water. So that's basically the shoreline to about where King County owns the trail. There are a number of older developments and older areas that have not necessarily land that they own, but they might have an upland easement that they bought so people could walk to the lake. And I think that those should be protected. I believe that they will be accepted under the changes that you had. And those people don't necessarily drive a car or anything. If there's a way that they can walk to, they can get to that. And I think that should be preserved. So I wanted to make sure as part of the public hearing that any of the upland areas that have existing easements, that those are kind of grandfathered in and accepted, because that is important. And a lot of that input was put in when King County did the trail thing at the 65% plan, and there were multiple hearings and multiple days of input and lots of public, and the hearing examiner read all those. I think what Eric Brooks talks about, the people having the view of the lake, is important. I always worry about how many boats can be moored in the lake, and if you're really looking to avoid, minimize, and mitigate, I really wonder if every single private individual house has to have its own dock, or if maybe the codes couldn't say, hey, you know, maybe if you got together with your neighbors, or less, then there'd be less docks overall, because I think that would impact the lake less. And I also I forgot to mention that some of the easements for walking down to the lake are only 10 feet wide, but that's all you need to walk through and carry your blow-up kayak to be able to go pour or paddleboard in the waters of the state, which is Lake Sammamish. And then Mark Cross had brought it up that the 303D list for polluted, Lake Sammamish is an impaired water body, and it's because it has fecal coliform and a couple other things, I think tissue PCB. I have not seen the most recent report from ecology on what the status is for Lake Sammamish or for Pine Lake or Beaver Lake. I don't know if that's available from ecology, but it seems like providing that as part of this would be awesome. I did meet with somebody from ecology earlier and found out you are working on it for the year, but there ought to be a current snapshot, because I know we have old snapshots in the city documents, so I would like to see that. And then other than that, I don't think I have anything I didn't highlight. So thank you for the work that you're doing in your considerations.
Thank you, Mary. Next is Jennifer McBride. No comment. Got it. Next, is that Senna? Is that a no comment as well? Are you sure? Okay, and last on the list, Tom Harsh. Nothing. All right. Anyone else who would like to make public comment? Mr. Stickney.
Good evening, Planning Commission. Paul Stickney, 22626 Northeast Inglewood Hill Road. Just a couple of thoughts. I echo a lot of what Mark Cross said, and one thing that went through my mind while he was talking is how many. So if I missed it in this, which I may have, I'll stand educated if you can say, but I'm curious of all the number of single-family lots in Sammamish, on Lake Sammamish and Pine Lake and on, Beaver Lake. How many rec lots are there in proportion to that, just to kind of get a scale of the issue that is being worked on? But I do agree that the size of the rec lots is an issue as well. And then I just want to take a quick look. I only think I had a couple of other thoughts. While I check out my notes, curious if Redmond, Bellevue, or Issaquah have any similar code or city policy to deal with rec lots. So do they have those policies or not? And if so, what are those policies? I think that could be interesting as well. And on the streams issue for, type F, I think, protecting fish is important. I'm a forester, I agree. But I wonder if it might be wise to give the city council a either or. Either consider adopting it now, or since critical areas are coming up, I would say, and I'll chime in for a second, that I wasn't expecting a retyping of streams with this whole, SMP update, and I'm not against the thought, but would it be more appropriate to let sort of have a little bit deeper dive into the issue and have both sides, pro and con, have a little more chance to chime in on what it would mean to go from 75 feet to 150 feet? It's a pretty big deal, but I am for supporting the fish. I'm just curious if it would be wise to do that with a little more, pro and con, public involvement during a critical area updates that's coming next year. So you may or may not want to give the city council that idea as an either or. That's it.
Thank you, Paul. Anyone else? Sure, come on up. Make sure you,
So I want to be mindful of the time. Am I allowed to ask a question on the updated proposal during my time, or is that a different thing?
go ahead, and I'll say maybe.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
Make sure you state your name and address at the beginning, please.
I will, sir. Thanks. Sorry, it's my second meeting. So, hi, Anthony Bice, 211th Avenue Northeast, 1544 211th Avenue Northeast. We read the updated proposal, and just the quick question is, I see the recreational use lot. I'll look at the lot types. The second one was private homeowners association, and then the third one was new expanded private beach park. Which it wasn't clear to us, which one would we consider IBC Inglewood Beach Club falling into?
I guess the question back is it deeded?
That's good. I don't know. I'll have to find out.
If it's deeded and managed through covenants with an HOA that accompanies it, then it would fall into the second category.
Okay.
Which would be the residential use. So it's all about uses and modifications. So
Okay.
the way we work that is that if it's a residential use that then owns the tract, like an extension of the subdivision or the area,
yeah.
and it's being managed that way, and it supports the residential use, then the modification is allowed as a residential use.
I got you. Okay. So I'll follow up. So it's an extension of the community. We pay monthly dues or annual dues. I just wanted to see if we can get that clear.
I believe we talked about this actually at the last meeting in the Inglewood Beach Club, and since it's existing, pretty much as long as you're existing, you're existing.
Okay. All right. So I'll double check on the deed, but we think it's it's the second bucket.
And
Okay.
I suggest follow up just to make sure.
Okay. I'll follow up with you. Thanks, guys. Thanks. Sorry to take your time. Thank
That's
you.
okay, thank you. Anyone else? All right, I'm going to close the public hearing. So next, if anyone is so inclined, what we need to do is have a motion and a second so that we can have discussion. And if you look at the agenda where it says recommendation, that's a pretty close, you can skip the first little part of that there, but that's a pretty close set of wording that would provide the motion. So if you're in support of moving some of this forward to the city council, we need a motion and a second.
I can propose a motion. I recommend that the Planning Commission recommend to the City Council that they adopt the proposed code change to SMC 25 as presented in Exhibit 3 and proposed code change to SMC 21A.15.1240 to mirror WAC 222-1630 as proposed by the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe in Exhibit 8.
I second that motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion or debate?
I was wondering, for a question to the chair, looking at the time, would it be good to take a break, say a 5-minute break now rather than at 8:35 or 9 or what? It's kind of what the body would like to do, but I was...
Anyone else? I'm all right now, but we will keep close track of it.
Well, would it be in order to do the extension now till...
I think we can.
Yes. I would move we extend the meeting of June 6, 2019 until 9 p.m.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to preemptively extend the meeting to 9 p.m. Any comments? All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Okay, we're extended. Back to the motion. If there are comments or discussion, let's start with Ratuja.
Yep. I just wanted to make a comment. I think, I think we've had excellent public comment. I think it reflects sort of the values that we have here in Sammamish, which is really caring about the habitat that we have, the wetlands, the environment, the lakeshore. And I think the changes that we've made, I think, as has been raised in the public comment, I think from an implementation perspective, I think there are certainly definitely challenges, but I think we're moving in the right direction. So I support the changes that are made to the municipal code in respect to the shoreline and also to the stream type. I think especially with stream type, I know there's a concern of the expanded buffers needed, but I think where we are right now in our city, where so much has been built, I think this actually would help us, come back to the neighborhood character that we really like to preserve. And I think in the same time, it's also going to help us preserve our environment. So I am in full support, and I also want to acknowledge, the staff who has done a lot of good work in cleaning up and taking my suggestions and sort of making sure that it's an easier read on the code. So thank you for taking those changes and helping me walk through this.
Let's just go down the line, Commissioner Cross.
Okay. There's been a lot of really good information tonight, and I, for one, am not really ready to make a decision. I'd really like to consider some of these issues that have been brought up on both sides of the fence, those wanting to move forward and those not. I think there's a lot of information I'd have to feel a lot better. I'd like to figure out about the loopholes in dock size. the buffering, and I'd like to find out a little bit about the city's perspective on purchasing these lots that are not buildable as they become available. When I worked for the city of Bellevue, Bellevue was very actively involved in that kind of process to resolve the issue of a lot of the things that we're talking about if the city just purchased the property and that was done. But those are questions that are still open and out there, and I understand the thing about scheduling. I get it. But I just have a conscience about moving stuff forward just for the sake of scheduling and not making things difficult. Sometimes things should be difficult and hard. So I'm still up in the air on that. That's my perspective right now.
Commissioner Brooks, I'll go to you next if you want, or no one's jumping in, so.
Although I do share many of the comments about, we need to take care of these issues. I do feel like we're being rushed through. We're trying to meet this deadline, right? And that is a noble cause. However, it seems to me that there's some other work that could be done from the point of view of the comp plan shoreline component, right? There's some cleanup that could be done in there to make this whole overall process be a little more tidy. And it seems like it's just, we're not even addressing any of those. And I don't know how much appetite there really is tonight to kind of take up those proposed changes in there. And I didn't really come prepared to propose a bunch of changes, but just trying to highlight just the obvious issues here in that regard. So I know that it was in 2009 that the first public comments were made for the SMP, right? It took a couple years for it to get adopted. So it's been technically 10 years since public comments really been taken up on our shorelines and this kind of stuff. So does it make sense that we need to have a little bit more robust? I understand it was robust then, but it was 10 years ago, and things have changed, and ideas have changed, and thoughts have changed, and land use development has changed, and so does it make sense to kind of really do the work, like Mark said? So.
Facebook had a saying, move fast and break things, which worked well for the company when it was young, but not so much anymore. And I think we might be doing that here. We just don't know what we're breaking or necessarily what we're fixing. Specifically, I'm thinking of changing the stream classification. It could really impact some people, and we have no data to know what that would be. And if city council members were to ask me individually if I was going to, if I would recommend that change to them, I wouldn't be able to give them a knowledgeable response. So I don't feel like at this time it's something that I could support. I think some public comment brought some great questions up that we didn't have time to really dive into to get answers on. I think staff did an excellent job in the changes they made from the previous iteration to now. I think it addressed a lot of what the commission brought up during the last meeting. I just don't know that moving this quickly on something so big when we don't know the ramifications of some of these changes is the right thing to do. So I don't know that I can support the motion.
I think I can support the motion because I keep coming back with the term, what we're really doing is a review, and not so much making changes, but we're reviewing what's out there and fitting it into the overall variety of plans we have. In the comp plan, and I just looked a minute ago, it really talks about promoting and protecting environment. I guess I'd like to move it forward to the city council with that in mind. Let them hear what the public has to say and go from there.
So a couple comments. First, I guess I share some of the concerns, particularly the streams. I think that that's a laudable change that we should consider, but perhaps we're doing that a bit too quickly without enough information. So perhaps we remove that from the recommendation. Another thing I think, and doing so with the idea that it will be part of a future discussion when we have the opportunity to dig into it a bit more deeply. So that's something to consider. Another thing I did, when we talk about these being smaller lots and how they would be used, one of the things that I was trying to look for in the revised version of this was areas in which a residential use was somehow different from a private beach park type use, and does that make sense? And Mark Cross made the comment about some of these lots being small. I do think that I may want to propose, and I'm only considering this out loud, but the one thing that is quite different is the dock size. And if these lots are small, and we're allowing smaller lots to put in larger docks, while I want to not get in the way of people using their property, that's an area where it seems like if it was a house, if it was big enough for a house to begin with, then they could only put a 480 square foot. But now it's too small for a house, and now they can put 1,000 square feet. I'm not sure that that intuitively makes very much sense to me. So my comment here is that perhaps there are some things that we could modify and still move some of the key pieces, particularly the state's checklist, forward to the council for their consideration. And the last comment I would make is that when it comes to these private park beach uses, however we describe that, I want to be cautious not to allow the desire for perfection be the enemy of progress. Right now, we're not really treating those as anything. And so perhaps the language that we're proposing isn't perfect. There may be things about it that are, need some further discussion. But if we do nothing, we're leaving them as nothing. And that's kind of part of the point of why I think the staff brought this up originally, is that there's a use that creates somewhat of a dead end for them when somebody wants to do something. And so if we move something forward and can put something in place and have some rules and some brackets around that use and create a permitting process, will it be enforced all the time? Is our tree retention policy enforced all the time? Is our tree cutting policy enforced all the time? Are the speed limits in the city enforced all the time? No. We know that. But if we have some policy in place that gives us the opportunity when there's a complaint or an issue to do something, it seems that that may be better than nothing. And then we move forward to the next step, whether that's part of the comp plan update, whether that's part of the critical areas update, and we consider further changes and refine what we've done. But I would hate to hold on doing anything only because we're worried that this is only 70% of the way there, because right now we're kind of at zero when it comes to those parcels. So I guess I haven't made any proposed amendments here, but I would like to get a feel from the commission whether there's at least the potential for making some of those kinds of amendments that would deal with some of the concerns that we have about moving too quickly on certain issues, perhaps intensity of use, and then move something to the council? Or is that a lot of time spent that we'll just end up extending the meeting and not accomplishing anything? I'd like you to at least have you consider that, and if you have any comments, I'd like to hear what they are.
So I think one question that I have is especially because I do support the change of the stream classification, is, I think in preparation for this meeting, I've reached out to the staff and asked, whatever data that would help me understand, and I see the benefits definitely outweighing, not making that change, especially for the overall health of our environment and also, potential land use as well. So I'm just wondering what data is the commission looking for, which will help them decide, especially for stream classification, because we won't be able to get that comprehensive data. We won't get a list and inventory of all the streams that are in the city. And this would come up only when, for example, we have an acre lot right now, which is zoned for R4. Maybe it's, somebody wants to build 4 houses instead of 1, and they come up with a application process, and that's when, if a stream is discovered. So it's going to be very, I think is my understanding correct? This is something that is going to happen as we go along, and I think if we don't have these kind of guidelines in place, we're going to miss out on protecting our environment as we go ahead. So for the stream, especially for the commissioners who have concerns, I'm just curious in understanding what other additional information that, potentially the staff can provide right now or to help understand this issue.
So on the stream issue, it's not just existing streams, it's the potential for streams that could have fish or fish bearing. It's not just people know there's a stream there with water, it could have nothing there, but then a change happens down the road and now this has the potential to have a stream. And we have, somebody who has private property right now could essentially have none in the future. We just don't know at all what kind of impacts this change will have on those people. That's where, and there's been no public comment on that change. Well, I guess there's one public comment, but I don't know that there was broad outreach for public comment on what this change might mean for people. Now, I agree that it's a laudable goal. I just don't know what the ramifications are for property owners.
Staff, can you maybe help clarify?
Yeah, so there's really 2 purposes here, right? One is we're trying to clean up the code, get it in alignment with what the state law says. And the second part is we're also trying to raise awareness around the importance of these natural resource features in the city. Now, it's important to point out that in the code, the way 21A50 is structured, if you have an existing use or development, it's an existing use section, and you could redevelop the property in the same footprint, and a stream buffer would not have an implication the way it's set up. Not only that, but you'd be allowed to expand up to a one-time 1,000 square foot expansion of impervious surface, building, et cetera, so long as it doesn't get closer to the stream than where it currently is. So there's quite a bit of flexibility built into the code for existing development. The biggest implication that this has is with regard to vacant lots or subdivisions. So if you had a vacant lot and you wanted to build a new home on it, and today you have a type NP stream, you have a 75-foot buffer, say you could fit your home in there, and tomorrow if we change the rule and suddenly it was a type F stream, you may not be able to fit your home in there. You'd then be required to go through what's called the city's reasonable use permit process, which would grant you relief in order to minimize any potential modifications to the buffer, et cetera. So then the last one is, as I previously described, subdivisions. So the impact to existing development is really not so great, because you can continue to maintain, use, expand, redevelop what you have now. That was put in place with the last critical areas update that was done. So it really is those vacant lots and the potential to subdivide because of what implication the buffer has on density. I don't know if that answered directly the question. The other issue is it was raised by the public or the public comment that there are these inventories out there. There are. We found those to be full of omissions, problems, errors. They're a great estimate of where things might be. And a lot of those were done remotely. They were not done by accessing or walking reaches of streams. If they were, then they were likely trespassing because they did not go out and comprehensively get private property access. And in my experience, in my time in Bellevue as a staff planner over there, we tried to get access, and people told us, no way, you're not coming on my property. So it's sort of one of the difficulties in trying to get the data that you're asking for is something that we really can't provide.
On the state law aspect that's been brought up, that's a whack, and it's a state definition of. It's not a requirement that cities adopt a definition of.
That's correct.
Okay.
This may be in here beyond these rec lot issue and the salmon stream issue. What other state required changes have we needed to make in this with this update?
So that was included with the first meeting as an exhibit. It's also included, I believe, tonight as an exhibit. Did we include the table of changes that occurred? Do you have the staff report?
I don't think it's in the printouts, but it was in the original agenda.
With the original agenda as part of the checklist, it identified where changes were made in order to address any changes in state legislation related to shorelines. There were very few, I believe, and there had been some members of the public that have actually emailed me about some of the changes. They're related to, let's see. My assessment of them, by the way, is that none of them are change our code and how it's applied. There are some changes and clarifications in language in order to conform to the state changes, but it does not actually change or affect on the ground how things are applied or the outcomes. So that's a general finding that I made with it. That there's some regarding non-conforming uses and development, for example. However, much like the critical areas rules, the city's shoreline rules also have a carve-out for existing development that allows you to maintain, redevelop, and in some limited instances expand existing non-conforming development, so long as it was legally established. That's one change that was made, and that's actually one email communication that I have that I think is in the communication bundle here. And I think we forwarded it on to you. Exhibit number one. Let's see. Another change was with regard to recognizing the ordinary high water mark when you're making a beneficial change to the property, like removing a bulkhead, for example. That's one change, because that was a change in state legislature as previously described, where they were intending to try to promote people doing the right thing. The definition of development was updated to not include dismantling or removing structures if there were no other associated development or redevelopment. So the idea here is if you want to tear down something on the shoreline, we're not going to require you to get a shoreline substantial development permit if you're not putting anything back. Again, that I think is a beneficial change because some people would hesitate to tear something down that might warrant being removed if they have to get a permit to do that. So what it did was it just redefined what development is. The forest practices one that you brought up was with regard to recognizing state changes regarding how we handle forest practices. But again, I can't think of a property here in the city where that might apply. But we still wanted to add it in order to be conforming to the state rule.
So it sounds like most of them are fairly mundane updates that are being asked by the state. And it's really this fish-bearing stream and the recreational lot issue that's really not being driven by the state that we're all getting hung up on.
So that's correct. The fish-bearing.
And you had mentioned earlier that there was a component of our code that hadn't been yet developed that would address more directly these recreational lots. Is that, or was it the public recreation or something like that? I forgot what you.
What's that? Oh, so The thing here with the rec lots is we've run into some, as was described by your chair, we've run into some dead ends. These are extremely difficult for staff to navigate. And the option is to do nothing. We brought it to you voluntarily and willingly with the idea that we felt we were trying to do our jobs. We felt like this needed some cleanup. You know, I actually disagree with the characterization made by one of the members of the public tonight that we don't follow up on anything. We don't require maintenance and monitoring. We actually have a comprehensive program where people submit monitoring reports for the prescribed period. So some of the testimony we heard tonight, I wholeheartedly disagree with. If you want to ask my staff how I drive them to push for submittal of monitoring reports, et cetera, you know, we have a program. So that I find was not completely true. So you know, some of the issues that we're talking about here with docks, I do agree the dock size is one that's an issue. You know, should you be allowing the construction of a larger dock on a smaller lot? There are some things we can't control. If someone wants to sell shares of their property to someone else, I don't know how we can control that. If someone wanted to take their single family home and turn it into a wedding event place and make a private park out of it, I don't know how we could control that either. With the way the rule is now, they'd have to go through a conditional use permit to do that. And at least we'd have a crack at trying to get an understanding how that use fits in on the shoreline, what people think of it, and we would have the ability to apply unique conditions to it that they'd have to conform to try to abate some of the potential for impact.
I think to add, you should also add that it gives neighbors the opportunity to be aware of and have input, which to me is as important as any of the rest of it.
Correct.
So we mentioned that the fish-bearing stream could be taken up in a critical areas ordinance thing. Can the recreational lot, is there another vehicle that those issues could be addressed besides this SMP update?
That is a uniquely shoreline issue. So we would have to reopen the Shoreline Master Program, which we could do at a later date if you wanted to push a uniquely recreational lot related update. We bring it back to the state in the future and propose a Shoreline Master Program amendment.
That would provide additional opportunity to get more in the weeds and get better understanding about what we're really trying to address, right? Or at least have that potential.
Time permitting, again, you know, we have a lot of work going on here, limited staff body, limited number of commission meetings, limited number of city council meetings. So it's the question of, you know, we took a crack at trying to address where we thought the shortcoming was to put in place a program where there was some thought that went into how these things fit in. I don't, just thinking about it, you know, there could be some refinements around exact criteria. There could be some refinements around dock sizes. One thing you could do as a matter of making an amendment here is you could recommend that for recreational lots that they're limited to 480 square feet in dock size, which is the size of a dock that you could get with a single family home, as opposed to the 1,000 square foot or whatever it is dock that you can get when you're a joint use partnership.
That's exactly what I was just going to suggest. Thank you. Why can't we just define it that way and remove the dock issue and use a square size or some notation that it's limited to whatever size and put that in the definition?
I had a quick clarification question on the dock. And I don't know anything about docks. Is that 480 square feet, is that like a standard? Is that, I mean, especially when the lot size gets smaller, is that what we could consider as, you know, the maximum size could be 480 square feet, and then can we have gradations of that? And the other question that I had along with that as well is, you know, when they come for permitting, for example, would the permitting department or you have the discretion to to change this? Or, could you require them to have a smaller dock size than what, if they said we want to install 1,000 square feet dock, could you just say, no, your lot is really small, we can't allow that, you have to modify your application?
So with the conditional use permit process, you could actually condition it to be smaller. I might regret saying this later, but if you designed this so that it was a criteria that the dock size was proportionate to the upland lot area available for use, then that'd be something that would put some parameters around it. Docks are tricky because they're largely seen as a right. And we get into many debates with property owners around the size of their dock and how it's to be built. And over time on Lake Sammamish and Lake Washington, what used to be called the Regional General Permit 3, RGP 3, framed the dock size at 480 square feet, which was reasonable for a single family home. And that got most of the dock builders into alignment with what was considered to be a right as to how much dock you could have, because ultimately it's what the Army Corps will approve. So what ends up happening here is we also allow for a joint use dock that serves multiple properties that can be bigger, because the idea there is that if you have multiple residential properties using one dock, there's actually fewer docks and it gets more people out down to the water.
Yeah, 480, if 480 is kind of our standard for everybody, then it should be the standard for everybody. So maybe I'd like to move to amend by, and this is a little tricky because of the language, but I'll give it a shot and hope that Sarah captures it and you guys can figure out the words. But I would amend 27.07.050 to E, which is the dock provisions, to eliminate paragraph II and paragraph III. Those are the larger dock options, and slightly modify the language of I, or 1, so that it's 480 square feet, period. You have to change the wording a bit there. And then I believe you will also further need to modify F to eliminate II to be consistent with what's up above. So those two, if you make those two amendments, I believe that brings this back to 480 square feet in exact conformance with a residential lot, and the same thing with a recreational use lot.
I second the motion.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to make those modifications. Let's have any discussion.
Okay, are you going to restate the motion for the whole thing?
Maybe the way to summarize it is to modify 27.07.050 Part 2 under paragraphs E and F such that recreational use lots will have a maximum dock size or overwater coverage of 480 square feet, consistent with residential use lots. Any discussion?
Clarifying question.
Yeah.
The passage of this motion is an amendment of the
Exactly.
motion
Yeah,
currently in.
It's an
okay.
amendment, exactly.
So I call for the question, the vote on the amendment.
Okay, voting on the amendment. All those in favor of this revision, say aye.
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 Opposed, say no. Okay, the amendment's passed. So at this point, we have the original motion moving this forward to the city council as amended by changing the dock restrictions to match residential lots. Are there further things that we would like to change before we consider the main motion?
I guess I don't have language. I would like the stream classification removed from the amended to remove the motion, and I would like to take this back up again as soon as we possibly can and get some more details and public input.
So I believe that your amendment is to remove the portion of the motion that says, I'm
Sorry,
reading
trying
it
to
here.
find it here.
Give me a moment to read. And where it says, okay, it says Exhibit 3, that stays. And then the following language, and proposed code changes to SMC 21A 15-1240 to mirror WAC 222-16-30 as proposed by the Snoqualmie Indian Tribe in Exhibit 5. Those words would be removed from the motion. I believe that's the wording that goes with the,
It's Exhibit A.
Exhibit
sort of.
8, because it was,
sorry,
which
because-
was handed out.
Yeah.
Is that clear enough what the amendment is? Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to remove those words from the main motion, which would remove the stream classification change at this time. And I do think that in the letter, transmittal letter, if this is passed, in the transmittal letter, in recognition of your comments, we need to be clear with the council that we're not necessarily opposed to this, but feel like it's not ripe enough. I believe you like that term. It's not ripe enough for us to fully consider at this time. Okay, any further comments on that? Questions?
It seems to me that we might not have good luck at getting any more resolution on this topic down the road, is what it sounds like, given the fact that we're not going to know any more about these streams and about their locations and about their impacts. Is that true?
So this has actually been, so one of the benefits here is, even if this doesn't move forward, it's been extremely informative to us about the questions that you're asking and what the public is asking. And we will definitely collect as much information as we can that we have available to us. And we may even, as a matter of our critical areas update, fund some broader exploration of sample basins. So if you were to take an example basin, we could feasibly fund one basin and do an analysis about how that might affect that basin, as opposed to the entire city, which I don't know where we'd find the funding to do that. So that's the type of thing we could do for you, and come back to you with that. The other part of it is when we do update our critical areas ordinance, because our critical areas ordinance is incorporated by reference into our shoreline master program, we will have to bring that back to the state again for state approval. So the state will be hearing this again at a later date when we bring it back to them, and that's one of the reasons why this is an opportunity to do this, is because any changes that are made to our critical areas rules that are incorporated by reference into our shoreline rules ultimately require state approval for them to fully be integrated into our shoreline rules.
I would just add that I think, sorry, Larry, I would just add that I think that the other thing is I'd really like to hear more public comment on this topic. I don't think it's technical enough and hard to pick out of this particular current conversation that I'd like to hear more, or give people the opportunity, perhaps some landowners or some people who are, affected by it, to have the opportunity to comment. And if there's no comment, then that tells us something as well.
And we'll also look and see if there's opportunity to get this back in early 2020 for you. I know the agenda's full all the way to the end of 2019. And it's possible we could do a very specific targeted amendment with some outreach to the public to get more people involved, try and spur some conversation on this. It might be easier to conquer this as an independent item as opposed to it being bundled with the broader critical areas update, just saying, because it's something that it will strike a lot of interest, I think, if we start to do some outreach on it.
I really would like to see things move forward, but I just heard Mr. Piles say something that I think is really, really good. There's a lot going on, and you didn't say it, but communication, information, and education, here's an opportunity for the city to really take this subject of streams and make it community-wide. And I think for that reason, and maybe that reason alone, I could see it be taken up again. Or taken off of this and go to the critical area, as the amendment said.
I just want to mention, I feel it's important that we not push this ahead, because I think there's if we adopt this change or recommend it to the city council, the city council can come up with the same questions and say, hey, it's too early for us to decide. But I think we have to be proactive and really looking into the future, and knowing, especially, with the development that has happened in Sammamish, that maybe we've already lost many of these streams we don't have access to. and really being proactive about, at least for the upcoming projects to identify these streams. I think that's really important in our community. And I know a lot of volunteers, for example, who work with, the wetlands and, reforestation. And that's a big concern, especially with the drought. Actually, I think that's also going to impact the stream classification. So I think in the better community interest and also, going back to the values of our residents who live in Sammamish, I think it's really important that we actually consider the stream type classification as we move ahead. And I think to Chairman Crandall's point, I think that for us would be an excellent educational opportunity as well. I think what I fear is, especially when we come to the critical areas update, and I think we have some very passionate members in our public today as well who are very passionate about critical areas. I think we are going to have so much on our plate to take care of and address. Because again, that window is getting smaller and smaller. And so for me, it's really important that we do take this up. And like I said, our job is to really take those policy decisions which impact the larger community and the environment. So I still support, having, making that change to the stream classification as we go ahead.
Call for the question on the on taking the streams out.
The amendment, yep. Okay. It's been moved and seconded to remove essentially the last two sentences of the paragraph, which would remove the stream classification proposed revision. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
No.
So we have 4-2, so that amendment passes. Okay, any further suggestions, amendments, questions, comments before we move to the main motion?
I call for the question on the main motion.
I believe I'm technically supposed to get a second on that, which I didn't do before, so my apologies for breaching protocol. All of you Jurassic parliamentarians should have caught me on that. All right, the questions have been called. We're now voting on the main motion as amended. And I don't believe I need to read that again, or do I? Because it's a little bit of a mess at this point for me to read. But it's to present the recommended modifications to the SMP to recommend to the City Council the modifications to the SMP as amended per this discussion. Okay? So all those in favor of making that recommendation to the City Council, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. Okay, thank you. The motion passes. The recommendation will go to the City Council as amended with the two amendments. All right?
No. Even though I'm going to not accept the promotion that I received down there, we still have a great chair, and so I'm addressing the chair. I move that we extend the meeting until tonight's meeting till 9:10 p.m.
Second.
All right, all those in favor of extending to 9:10, say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Okay, we're going to technically extend to 9:10. Thank you, everyone. I really would like to say that we appreciate people coming to these meetings and making comments. It makes a big difference to us that people take an interest and provide input, and we really do appreciate that, both in email and in person. Thank you very much. We have nothing further on the agenda unless there's anything from staff.
We have calendar.
Did you want to look at the calendar?
That was under the, excuse me. Wasn't long-term calendar part of the agenda?
For the evening, yes, it's one of the items in there. That's for your reference.
Yeah, it's for reference. We have a couple more meetings before our August recess. Okay, would someone move to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. Thank you. We are adjourned.